Thanks a lot. Thank you for the intro, and thank you everyone for coming out on a Saturday. I know it's a big call to get people out on the weekend, especially with beautiful weather like this. So thank you for coming and listening to me. What I'm about to share with you today isn't my individual work. I'm here representing Canva's engineering interview process team. They're the ones who figured out how to make this transformation happen. And while I provided the initial push, they're the ones that solved all of the hard problems. Before we start, a quick show of hands. In the last week, how many of you have used an AI coding assistant like Copilot, Claude, Code, or Cursor? So it's pretty much everyone at this point. And also, hands up if you're in a management or a role where you're making decisions about hiring. Okay, so a couple of people. Let me describe a problem that we're all facing. 20 years ago, if you interviewed at a tech company, you may have been asked a question like this. And it seems a pretty simple question. Given an integer n, return true if n is the power of 2. Let's make it a bit more specific. We'll say that our input n is an unsigned 32-bit int. Now there's many ways you can answer this question, and I'm sure you can think of some. So let's take a couple of looks at them. We could implement the function like this, and we compare the input against all known powers of 2 that will fit within 32 bits. This is definitely not pretty, but it will get the job done. Or we could do something like this. We'll take the number, first check if it's 0. Otherwise, we'll repeatedly divide the number by 2 until it either reaches 1 or finds that the number is not evenly divisible by 2. If you think about it a bit more, you might come up with this clever trick, which is you subtract 1 from the number, you bitwise AND that with the original number itself, and if the answer is 0, then the number was a power of 2. Or you might happen to know that there's actually an assembly instruction that will count the number of bits set within a number. And so you can call this instruction, which is pop count, and if the answer is 1, which is 1 bit set, then the number was a power of 2. So there's many other approaches, and I'm sure you can come up with your own. But let's take these 4 and consider what they tell us about candidates. We'll consider 3 criteria. First, does the answer demonstrate a level of mathematical insight and an understanding of how numbers are represented within computers? Second, how does the answer fare in terms of efficiency? And third, how extensible is it? If later on we need to switch this and switch it to, say, a 64-bit number, are we going to have to go back and change the code? So here's how I think the solutions rate. And the question is, which one would we hire? So hands up if you'd hire the candidate who produced number 1, the conditional. No one in the room. All right. What about candidate number 2, the person who produced the for loop? Couple of hands. What about number 3, the person who came up with the logical AND trick? Okay, more people. And number 4, the assembler programmer. All right. Oh, okay. This is a bit divisive. So some hard no's and some yeses. And who doesn't know who they'd hire? Who's unsure? All right, some honest people. So I'd actually argue that I don't know is the correct answer here. Why? Because I never told you what job we were hiring for. And context is everything when it comes to hiring. Because without knowing the job that the person's supposed to fulfill, how on earth are we supposed to evaluate them? And at its core, interviewing is a very lossy process. We're taking the skills that the candidate has, we're passing them through the filter of an interview question, and then we're using the output of that to try and compare to what we think the job requirements are, and then make a hiring decision. And so it's critical that the interview question is a good representation for the position that we're hiring for. So on the left here, we've got an interview question that is a subset of the job requirements. This is a good question. It's going to give us a bunch of data points on how the candidate's going to perform in their day-to-day role. In the middle, we've got a question that is partially overlapping with the job requirements. It's okay. It's going to get us some data, but it's not going to be the most efficient way to interview. And on the right, we've got a question that is completely disconnected from the job requirements. And we're going to get hiring signal here, but it's not going to be any useful signal that we can use to try and make a decision. So that is, if the interview process doesn't match the role, we're going to end up hiring the wrong people. So let's jump back to the question for a moment, and I promise that I'm almost done with the code here. And we'll tweak it a bit. We'll now say that the input is a 128-bit unsigned integer, and let's see how we go with this one. So given that we don't actually have native 128-bit types, we're going to have to agree on a representation for this. So in this case, we'll use a struct with two 64-bit ints to represent the input. Now, this is a talk about AI, so let's see how some LLMs go with this question. First of all, we'll try Bard. So released March 2023, and let's be honest, the results are not great here. It at least knows about the logical AND trick, but it's got pretty confused as to how to handle the two separate inputs. And ChatGPT 3.5, which came out a couple of months before Bard, that also had similar issues. Now, I tend to be a bit of a skeptic, and so, beginning of 2023, when I started playing around with these tools, my response to this was something along the lines of, well, I can't see myself using these tools for writing code anytime soon. But now, fast forward to August this year, and ChatGPT 5 absolutely aces this question. And so I hope it's clear to everyone just how far these tools have improved and how useful these tools have become over the last 2 years or so. And then we see that improvement playing out in adoption metrics at Canva. So at the start of this year, we began tracking the usage of AI coding tools. This data does not include general purpose assistants, so this is not your ChatGPT, your Gemini, your Claude itself, but these are specific AI coding tools like Cursor, GitHub Copilot, AMP Code, etc. And as you can see, there's been a dramatic uptake of these tools to the point now where 65% or more of Canva engineering, that's including managers, are using these tools on a weekly basis. For folks wondering about some of the patterns in the data here and the spike in the trough, so in August, that was corresponding to our big Canva Create launch. We do a massive launch event twice a year. That was the April one. And we typically see in the lead up to that, the engineering output drops a little bit at the time. More engineers are focused on sort of like the launch aspects of it, polishing the product. And over here in July, that was our AI Discovery Week, where all the engineers paused their usual work for an entire week, and they could spend the entire week playing around with AI tools. So we didn't expect anything from them and just said, go wild, use the new tools, learn something new, and have fun doing it. The big uptick in February here was that unlocking Cursor. So over the summer break, I was on vacation, playing around with a bunch of AI tools, was playing around, spent some time with Cursor, and then came back and said, we've got to get this tool in the hands of our engineers. And so it took us 3 weeks from sort of me coming back and saying, let's go, passing all the security commercial reviews, and then we rolled it out to the entire engineering code base in less than 3 weeks. So with the adoption data, we also have the feedback to match this. In August this year, we ran our developer experience survey, and we received a lot of positive feedback about these coding tools. And as you can see from the comments, engineers find them really useful in many ways, like understanding new code bases and building prototypes. And they're really grateful that Canva has taken an approach of giving them access to many different tools rather than going with a single vendor. And I really enjoyed this comment here. I was a doubter 6 months ago, but when AMP Code, one of our tools, went down a few weeks ago, I was so lost in my routine. It's become an incredible multitasking tool for me, and thanks Canva for making it available. And we also see this reflected in the survey results as well, where 73% of our engineering org find that AI tools meaningfully improve their development experience and productivity. So what we're seeing and hearing is that the power of these AI coding tools, when paired with human judgment and expertise, unlock significant benefits. And the middle part around human judgment and oversight here is critical. Because central to our approach at Canva is that engineers remain accountable for the code that they produce. And that is, we retain a human in the loop. This accountability helps ensure that engineers avoid producing AI slop because they are judged on the quality of their pull requests regardless of how the code was written. Or as I like to say, AIs will save the typing, but they do not eliminate the thinking. So I'd argue, and I hope you agree with me, is that AI tooling has transformed the role of a software engineer. And if the role of the software engineer has changed, and interviews need to reflect the role to hire the right people, then we've got to change the interviewing process. And that was the conclusion that I reached at the beginning of the year. So let me take you back, beginning of the year, and provide some context on what Canva's engineering interview process looked like. This is a typical interview flow for a front-end or a back-end engineer. And I say typical because we have variants of this that we will use for the more senior levels or for some of the, the unique subspecialties like our analytics engineers. But first, the candidates would do a recruiter screen, and if they pass through that, then they'd move on to 4 interviews. The first interview, computer science fundamentals, would test their knowledge of data structures and algorithms. The second is a programming language fluency interview. And this is evaluating how well the candidates understands their chosen programming language. So we're looking for things like use of standard libraries, concurrency, understanding the memory model, that sort of thing. The third is a system design and architecture review, where rather than writing code, the candidates are talking about the trade-offs in designing sort of scalable and reliable systems. And the fifth final one is strategy, communications, and leadership, which is a behavioral style interview. And for all of these, we were really clear on our expectations with candidates. And this is part of the interview guidance that would get sent out to all candidates before they started going through the process. And we'd let them know well ahead of time that we required them to turn off all AI assistance during these interviews. But despite our policy, we were already seeing candidates by the beginning of this year starting to use AI interview assistance. There's software out there, it's been out there for at least a year now, that guides candidates through interviews in real time. It listens into the Zoom call, provides answers, suggests code, even helps with system design questions. And because we conduct our interviews over Zoom, like many other companies, preventing this, or detecting and preventing it, was nearly impossible. We'd waste valuable time during the interviews asking candidates to turn off or show their screens or disable extensions, etc. And even then, many of this software is undetectable. So you might catch someone sort of obviously looking at a second screen, but sophisticated candidates using AI assistance is much, much harder to spot. So we realized we were fighting a losing battle here. And so given this, we decided that rather than fighting the reality and trying to police AI usage during the interviews, we're going to make the decision to embrace AI and go for a method of transparency. And so with the decision made, I turned to our engineering interview process team, the folks I mentioned previously, and they're a bunch of people who, beside their day job, also work together to manage and improve the engineering interview process at Canva. So in the middle of this year, or middle of February, when I sort of got back from vacation, I gave them a challenge. So I said, what if we changed our interview process to remove all restrictions on AI? And actually going further from that, what if we not just allowed the use of AI, but actually now expected it in interviews? And if we could roll this out in 3 weeks, please, that would be great. Thanks. We'd like to move fast at Canva. So even within this small group, there were pretty mixed reactions. A couple of the members said that they were actually already thinking about something similar and were really excited to start working on these changes. But there were others with very significant concerns, and those fit into two broad categories. The first was that allowing AI interviews would lower the quality bar for candidates. And the second was that these changes were going to make it much harder on the interviewers. That is, we'd need to retrain hundreds of interviewers and then reevaluate them in how they interview. So I got together with the group. It's a pretty small group. We had a quick Zoom conversation. And I'd say after that conversation, they were really ready to embrace the challenge. But there was one thing that they all did agree on, and that was that it was going to take a lot longer than 3 weeks. And I'm very humbled to say that they turned out to be correct, so I should listen to them more next time. So before we get into how we tackle the problem, a really quick thank you to the sponsors of DDD, Perth, for providing all the support to make this day happen. So let's talk about the journey that the team went on. Like all good engineers, the first step was to start getting good understanding of the problem. So what we did is we identified our heaviest AI users and worked with them to start evaluating some of our common interview questions that we were using previously. It quickly became apparent that for a typical computer science fundamental question, ChatGPT-4 could get to the majority of the solution regardless of the candidate's actual skill level. And what was really concerning here was that it required neither good prompting skills nor any sort of formalizing of requirements to generate really well-written, decent, production quality-like code snippets. And now in our simulated trials of this, the candidates would spend most of their time trying to understand the code that the LMs were generating and then describing it back to the interviewer. And so that led to like really long, awkward silences and really broke the flow of the interview. So what ended up happening is instead of getting this sort of nice distribution where we can differentiate candidates, we'd see compressed performance around the hiring bar. And so we'd lose the ability to differentiate. That is, everyone could get through most of the question using AI, and only the final parts of the problem started giving us any meaningful hiring signal. And we also tried some of our programming language fluency questions. What we found here was really important and aligned to what our engineers were experiencing day to day. So while AIs did well at aspects like use of standard library and concurrency, The type of knowledge that would have appeared in the training data, they really fell down when they started trying to architect more complex pieces of software. And when solving problems, AIs tended to take the path of least resistance, doing the bare minimum to get the solution. And that's quite different from what experienced engineers will do. The experienced engineers will start building in best practices from the beginning. Like they'll put in abstraction layers, they'll understand how to separate concerns. Even if this takes slightly longer to get to a working solution, they're already thinking ahead and constructing software in the sort of the right way. And here's my hypothesis about why this is happening. If you look at the data that most LLMs that we have access to today, unless you work for sort of like one of these very big tech companies building your own, the data that they're trained on is sort of everything out there on the internet, right? And so it includes abandoned projects, toy projects, someone's homework assignment. All of that is mixed into the training data. And while there is some successful open source projects mixed in my experience, the really high quality, well-architected code we'd want to actually emulate is typically sitting in private company repos where teams have much different incentives when they come to writing software. And so that's not to downplay open source, but I suspect the knowledge of how to architect software really well is getting diluted out in this training data. And in fact, the reason why the early models struggled so much with that power of 2 question is because there was a Stack Overflow response for that exact 128-bit question that had the wrong answer. So all they were doing was emulating back what was in the training set. And so having ruled out most, if not all, of the computer science fundamental style questions, and with a decent understanding of where AI struggled, we started to turn to brainstorming new questions. With the mantra of AI save the typing, they don't eliminate the thinking, we tried to come up with questions that would allow candidates who had mastered AI the best opportunity to demonstrate their skills. And so we'd heard from our AI power users that they could solve problems much faster using AI than without it. So in coming up with questions, we started increasing the scope and complexity of our questions to match this accelerated ability. And because we now expected candidates to use AI in interviews, we deliberately designed questions where the scope would be too ambitious for a typical 45-minute interviews without AI assistance. And we started focusing on questions that had genuine ambiguity and substantial application-level complexity, the type of real-world problems where AI will amplify human judgment rather than just replacing it. So, armed with some ideas for questions, we started performing mock interviews with some of our Canva engineering volunteers. And this required a high level of vulnerability from these people that we were interviewing. Because remember, they themselves were trying to learn how to use these tools and apply best practices at the same time that we in the interview team were trying to learn how to best use them in our interview process. And so we made it very clear to them that we weren't judging their individual performance, no one was getting re-interviewed for their job, and we were trying to get an understanding of what was possible with AI here. And as we worked our way through the mock interviews, we began to get a good sense of what was working and what didn't. And so what we discovered from the mock interviews generally matched our intuition. The questions that the LLMs had seen before, especially leak code style questions that had clear optimal answers, could very, very easily be one-shot prompted. And however, questions related to the real world with a high degree of complexity required engineers to make trade-off decisions and sort of choose their own adventure in the interview process. So a great example of this is Conway's Game of Life. It is very, very easy to one-shot at this point. But if we were asked a candidate to design a control system for a busy airport, this immediately starts requiring human-level judgment on which parts to focus on. So for example, are we dealing with one runway or many runways? Or is there priority when it comes to takeoff and landing? Or are we trying to handle emergency landings? The list goes on. And with a time limit of 45 minutes, it requires candidates to be really thoughtful about what they consider as an MVP to avoid biting off too much of the problem and finishing the interview with nothing really working. So with the experience from a bunch of mock interviews, we started to converge on the evaluation criteria. The first thing we look for is how candidates handle complex, ambiguous requirements, which is a critical part of software engineering in the real world. Given the nature of the interview problems, we didn't expect them to jump into writing code immediately. We wanted to see them pause, start asking clarifying questions, and understand which parts of the problem they're going to focus on. And we're looking for how they use AI in the phase of requirements analysis. What we found is that the strongest candidates use their own judgment first to break down the problem, identify the key questions, and then start forming their understanding. Then they switch to AI to check their thinking. And it's that balance that we're looking for. Candidates who immediately just dump the entire problem into ChatGPT and say, like, what should I build? That's a really big red flag. But candidates who thoughtfully analyze requirements themselves, use AI as a bit of a sounding board to validate their approach or to surface gaps that they may have missed, that's the kind of engineering judgment that we're looking for. Once we get to the implementation stage, we're looking at how the candidates work with the tools. The first thing we notice is preparation. Did they come with an environment set up? Have they brought their own instruction files for these tools? Then we're looking at how they guide the AI to get the output that they're looking for. And critically, do they decompose the problem and then choose what to start doing themselves versus what to delegate to the AI? The strongest candidates have developed this really strong intuition about what tasks are worth automating versus the ones that they really need to retain control over. And we watch how they handle AI mistakes. If the AI veers off course, how do they deal with it and how do they correct it? Candidates who excel have clearly spent the time learning how to work effectively with these types of tools. And they've developed workflows and they understand the strengths and limitations. And they can adapt their approach based on what they're trying to achieve. The third, this is where we see the biggest difference between the strong and the weak candidates, is we're watching how they generate and handle AI code. Are they actively reviewing it, or are they just accepting what gets produced and moved on? The strong candidates treat AI-generated code just as they treat code from any other colleague. They review it really carefully, they understand what it does, and they're willing to modify or reject it if it doesn't meet their standards. And we pay attention to what parts of the code they're spending their review time on. Are they focusing on the right areas? The weak candidates just tend to accept AI output without any real understanding of it. And when we ask them to explain a particular function or design choice, they struggle because they didn't actually make the decisions that AIs did. But the strong candidates really maintain that ownership over the entire solution. They're using AI as a productivity multiplier, not as a replacement for their engineering judgment. And then we're looking at candidates who review AI-generated code the same that they'd review code from another engineer, very systematically and critically. Can they find the bugs? Not just the syntax errors, but logic errors, edge cases, or potential performance problems. And can they spot when AI has misunderstood the requirements entirely? Because sometimes these tools will generate perfectly functional code that doesn't solve the right problem. And how do they address the bugs that they find? Do they understand the code well enough to fix the issues themselves, or do they just ask AI to fix it without really understanding what went wrong? Because we've seen cases of candidates who get stuck in these endless fix-it loops with AI and don't make any progress because they don't understand the code. And finally, we look to understand a candidate's definition of production ready. Remember, our philosophy is that engineers are accountable for the code that they produce. How do they handle errors and exceptions? Do they think about graceful degradation, or do they just let things crash? How do they think about logging and observability? If this breaks in production, are they going to be able to figure out what went wrong? The candidates who understand production systems will naturally think about these concerns and take ownership of the AI-generated code as if they wrote it themselves. The weaker candidates will tend to treat it compiles and runs as production ready, and they haven't understood that they're responsible for everything that the AI produces. And this reveals who really owns their code or who just sees themselves as an AI operator. So, based on our findings on the mock interviews, we made the decision to replace computer science fundamentals interview format with a new AI-assisted programming format. This was a really significant change because computer science fundamentals had been a cornerstone of our technical interviews for many, many years, and removing it was not without risk. So to balance this risk, because we also wanted to make progress here, we made the call to leave the rest of the interview rounds as is and address them later on. And we also had to decide which disciplines to make the change for. And so we settled on front-end, back-end, machine learning, and infra engineers, because together this represents over 75% of Canva's engineering organization. And so these are the disciplines where coding was sort of most central to the day-to-day role, and where the AI tools internally were already showing the biggest wins. So we crafted new interview guidance that explained to candidates that they were going to be part of a pilot and that we'd be assessing their AI skills. And the real surprising thing here was that quite a few candidates responded and said that they were really excited by this new approach to interviewing. And with that, we ran the pilot for about 20 external candidates. This gave us really valuable feedback. The sentiment for the pilot was overwhelmingly positive. Both the candidates and the interviewers consistently reported that these interviews were more engaging and more enjoyable than traditional coding assessments. And what really stood out was how authentic they felt. The candidates described it as finally having an interview that reflected their day-to-day work, rather than what one candidate called it just cramming a bunch of algorithms just to forget about them the day after. And for interviewers, it felt like this collaborative pair programming session on real product challenges. The shift from artificial problem solving to realistic collaboration fundamentally changed the interview dynamic for the better. And because this interview format was new to candidates, we confirmed that setting clear expectations up front was critical. We found it better to over-communicate here rather than under-communicate about what to expect. We told candidates explicitly that they'd be expected to use AI tools and they should come prepared with their development environment already set up, and that we'd be evaluating their collaboration with AI rather than penalizing them for using it. The candidates who were the best prepared had practiced with the tools beforehand and understood the format. Those are the people who performed significantly better. And this wasn't about giving people an unfair advantage, but it was about ensuring that every candidate had the best possible chance to demonstrate their capabilities in the new format. And what we discovered was the most successful candidates weren't necessarily the folks who had used AI the most, but it was the ones who effectively combined AI with their own engineering judgment. While candidates who had more experience with AI tools did have advantages, we were surprised to find that sustained experience wasn't actually a prerequisite. One candidate spent a week learning these tools and was still able to secure an offer. On the flip side, heavy AI usage during the interview didn't guarantee success at all. Some candidates actually got lost in the tooling, spending far too much time trying to get the perfect AI output instead of using their own expertise to guide, validate, and refine the solutions. And the best performers, like I said, used AI as a productivity multiplier while maintaining control of the overall solution and applying critical thinking to incorporate the generated code. And the interviews provided strong hiring signals. This gave us confidence that we weren't losing our ability to evaluate candidates by focusing on AI tools or allowing AI tools. However, because this was such a new format, we decided to be conservative about the leveling decisions. And rather than using this interview format to guide both the hiring and the leveling, we initially treated it just a pass-fail assessment, and then we relied on our other established interview formats for the leveling determination. This allowed to validate the signal quality while reducing the short-term risk. Since we've rolled this out, we've gained a lot more confidence in the format, and now it's incorporated into the leveling discussions. One of the biggest lessons from the pilot was that the training for the interviewers is absolutely critical. These AI interviews are very different from traditional coding interviews, and they're harder to run, but they're also more flexible. Because instead of being passive observers and almost following a script, interviewers need to learn how to actively collaborate with the candidates, guide the conversation, and make real-time decisions about scope and direction. It's essentially a pair programming session rather than just sort of sitting back and administering a test. And the shift required really significant investment in training and practice sessions, because without proper training, even our most experienced interviewers struggled with the more dynamic, collaborative nature of these sessions. And the final challenge we encountered was that there was significant variation in candidates' access to AI tools. Some candidates came with highly customized environments and premium subscriptions. Others were using free versions that often hit rate limits midway through the interview. And we actually saw one candidate VPN into their existing employer because they wanted to use the tools that they provided. Don't recommend that. Folks from companies like Google and Meta, interestingly enough, because they have their own tools internally, they had to get familiar with sort of the tools available to everybody else, which behave in slightly different ways to what they're used to. So this created a bit of an uneven playing field that we had to navigate carefully. And we did consider providing all candidates access to a 30-day trial of software like Cursor, but unfortunately we haven't been able to come to an agreement with Cursor and other vendors on how to do this just yet. But we do expect that this will become much less of an issue over time as access to these tools become more ubiquitous, similar to how now we assume that every candidate has access to a laptop and an internet connection. The rapid democratization of these tools is already making this concern less relevant. So with all that, we were ready to roll this out. Based on the knowledge to this point, we started building comprehensive training materials. We recorded simulated interviews to teach interviewers what we were looking for, showing them real examples of what good and bad candidate performance looked like. And we wrote comprehensive evaluation guides describing the behaviors that we were looking for and how to handle various situations that we've seen arise during the mocks. Unsurprisingly, this announcement was not without controversy. The Slack thread, when I posted it, immediately lit up with responses from engineers, expressing serious concern about the changes. And their reactions were completely understandable. It was very similar to the concerns that were raised earlier by the engineering interview process group. And because of our month's worth of preparation at this point, we had solid answers that directly addressed these concerns. We could point to concrete data from our pilot showing that the bar hadn't dropped. In fact, we were now testing skills that were more relevant to engineering work. We could show that candidates still had to demonstrate deep technical understanding and that simply generating code without being able to understand it or improve it would result in a no-hire decision. And we had those that ran the pilots who acted as our ambassadors for the change and could go and speak to their experiences with the new format. So after months of internal work, mock interviews, pilot testing, we'd prepared for exactly these type of questions. So with all the preparation plus the training, the rollout went exceptionally well. Over the course of a month, we successfully trained hundreds of interviewers within the engineering organization. And we also held a dedicated session during that AI Discovery Week that I mentioned, which provided another valuable opportunity for interviewers to get hands-on experience with the new format. By the end of the training period, we had a confident, well-prepared interviewer base ready to implement this new approach. There was one piece missing, though. We didn't really have anything that we could point candidates to that clearly explained our new approach. And our interview preparation emails at this point were already getting uncomfortably long. So in June, we published this blog post telling the world about the change. This gave us a public reference point to share with candidates and help manage expectations as to what to expect. The post also generated quite a bit of discussion and press coverage online, sparking a sort of a broader conversation in the tech community about the future of these technical interviews. Approximately 3 months after the full rollout, we decided to check in with our interviewers. We wanted to know, was this actually working? How did they find the interviewers? Were we getting strong hiring signals? And what was their real-life experience on the ground? So we sent out a survey to everyone at Canva who had run one of these AI-assisted interviews. And the results were pretty interesting. The headline result was largely positive, because when we asked interviewers, can you discriminate between low and high-quality candidates using these AI interviews, the answer was yes, with backend and ML engineers reporting more favorably than infra and frontend. This told us a couple of things. First, that the format was working, we were getting meaningful hiring signals, but it also showed us that the interview worked better for some specialties than others. Backend and ML problems tend to have more well-defined interfaces and clearer quality metrics. Front-end work, especially when you're building UIs, can be a bit more subjective and hard to evaluate in a short interview window. So the signal was there, we just had to get better at recognizing it consistently across all the engineering specialties. And then when we asked, are you getting good signals about candidates' AI-assisted coding skills, the answer was positive across all specialties. Interviewers generally agreed that they were getting meaningful insights into how candidates actually work with AI tools. And this was validation that we were achieving our original goal. We weren't just allowing AI in interviews for the sake of it, we were actually now successfully assessing a skill that we believe matters. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, because when we asked about signal on computer science fundamentals, the results were far less encouraging. Back-end and machine learning engineers were roughly neutral, but the front-end and infra specialties showed really negative responses, with front-end peer particularly concerning. So now the AI interview wasn't intended as a drop-in replacement for computer science fundamentals, but these negative responses told us that we still had some work to do here. And although this was only one interview in the pipeline, it told us that we were potentially losing some important signals around algorithmic thinking and data structure knowledge that we used to get from the traditional CS interviews. And we weren't satisfied to give up on that signal entirely. So I'll talk in a moment about some changes that we made to address this. But let's not lose sight about what was working really well. The feedback highlighted some real strengths of the approach. Interviewers could clearly distinguish between candidates who had been incorporating AI into their workflows and staying current with best practices versus those who were even just a few months behind. As one interviewer said, these gaps are glaringly obvious. We also got excellent signals about core engineering principles. The vibe coded candidates who weren't really sure about what they produced, they would struggle to explain and review AI-generated code. And because candidates could generate a large amount of code quickly, interviewers could get a much better understanding of how they thought about application architecture and assessed code quality. Skills that are fundamental regardless of whether the code is AI generated or not. But there were also clear challenges that we needed to address. The biggest issue was that because we dramatically increased the scope of the questions, some candidates and even interviewers fell into the trap of measuring success by how much of the problem that they solved, turning to quantity over quality. Candidates were getting caught up in the excitement of generating a lot of code, but losing sight of the quality aspects. They prioritize completing as much of the task as possible over writing maintainable, well-reviewed code. And this created a challenge for the interviewers as well, because with so much code being generated, it became more difficult to go deeper into specific areas and really understand the candidate's thinking. And this feedback helped us understand that we needed to set even clearer expectation with interviewers and candidates to maximize the signals we were getting from this new format. So we made 2 key changes to address these issues. First, we clarified the balance between speed and quality. We now explicitly tell candidates upfront that we expect at least part of the code to be pull request level of quality. We wanted to strike a good balance between seeing how far candidates can get with AI, but also getting a sense of their quality bar. By using this language, we get a signal on candidates' view of production quality code without throwing away any of the productivity advantages that come with AI tooling. And second, we address the AI computer science fundamental gap by requiring interviewers to collect at least 2 data points on the candidate's technical depth and understanding. And we try and weave these questions into the interview naturally without breaking the flow while still capturing the signal that we need. So topics here could include runtime complexity, memory trade-offs, data structures and algorithms, and performance bottlenecks. The beauty of this approach is that the candidates can still use AI to generate their solutions, but they need to provide us with concrete evidence of the underlying computer science knowledge. These weren't large changes, but we're already finding that they improve the overall quality of these interviews. So 7 months after the journey began, where are we at? We now have an interview format that is quite different from where we started. Instead of asking candidates to turn off their AI tools, we expect them to come prepared with these tools and to use them really effectively. We've trained hundreds of interviewers in this new format who have then gone on to interview hundreds of candidates. And we've continued to iterate and improve based on the feedback. The result? We have a hiring process that is now more closely aligned to how Canva engineering works day to day and is aligned with Canva's AI everywhere philosophy. In July, 2 months after we rolled this out and 1 month after our blog post, Meta actually announced that they were doing the same thing. And so I don't know if Mark read our blog post, but I think the timing is pretty interesting. In all seriousness, this validates what we suspected, that the shift towards this style of interviewing is inevitable. Because when companies like Canva and Meta start to arrive at the same conclusion, it tells you about where the industry's going. We just happened to get there first. And if you want to try something like this similar to this, here's the cheat sheet. First, you really need to understand what you're hiring for. You can't just bolt AI into an existing interview process. You need to have adopted AI first and have a good understanding of the skills that are required. Like any major change, you need to identify your early adopters. We found our AI power users and learn from them before trying to scale this out to the entire organization. Invest heavily in training. It takes way more time than you think, because our interviewers really appreciated the workshops that we ran and the training materials that we provided them. And finally, monitor, adapt, and improve. We didn't get it quite right the first time, and subsequent changes came from listening to feedback and iterating on what we learned. So for the remaining time, I wanted to give you all some concrete actions that you can do when you're back at work on Monday morning. I'm going to break these into 2 groups, for the engineers and the actions for the managers, so you can focus on what's most relevant for you. First, for the engineers in the room. And these actions could define your career trajectory over the next few years. If your workplace doesn't provide you access to these AI coding tools, you need to advocate for them or you need to get access yourself, because without hands-on experience, you're going to fall behind. When we interview candidates now, the difference between someone who's been using AI tools daily versus someone who's had limited exposure is immediately obvious. And it's not just about how they use the tools, it's about developing that intuition for when to delegate to AI and when to take control. And if you're not using these tools regularly, you're missing out on developing this intuition. And later on, when you're looking for your next role, you're going to be competing against engineers who have been building this skill every day. So if your company hasn't provided access yet, start the conversation now. Show them the blog post, point them to this talk, and you can tell the leaders to come and talk to me. Get a personal subscription if you have to, because the cost of staying current is nothing compared to what the cost of falling behind is going to be. And this isn't optional anymore. It's table stakes for being a competitive engineer in 2025 and beyond. Because the consequences of not doing so are significant. Companies now are expecting AI fluency just like we expect AI engineers to know Git or understand testing techniques. Because when I talk to other engineering leaders, they're telling me the same thing. The candidates who can't effectively demonstrate AI collaboration are increasingly getting filtered out in the hiring pipelines. But it goes deeper than just interviewers. Because candidates who are pulling ahead in their current roles are the ones that have embraced these tools. They're shipping features faster, they're solving problems more creatively, and they're having more fun because they're focusing on the interesting parts of the problem rather than some of the tedious, low-value parts. And meanwhile, the engineers who aren't keeping up are becoming less productive relative to their peers. They're going to have to work harder to achieve the same outcomes. And then when promotion time comes around, guess who's going to be more valuable to retain at the organization? So even if you're happy with your current role, this is about staying competitive as where you are. Third, given the pace of development, this requires you to constantly stay up to date. As a reminder of how fast things are changing, at the start of this year, we were talking about coding assistants like Cursor and GitHub Copilot. Now, just 9 months later, we're using AI agents that can craft entire pull requests. This means that the cutting-edge AI skills of today will be baseline by the end of the year. It means that the tools that you standardize on now are likely going to get replaced in 6 months' time. So you need to build learning into your routine. Follow the AI engineering communities, experiment with new tools as they emerge. And don't just learn one assistant and call it done. Understand the principles so you can adapt as the technology evolves. Because engineers who treat AI learning as a one-time thing, rather than ongoing practice, are going to find themselves increasingly irrelevant. And focus your learning on 2 critical skills: how to steer AI effectively and where to apply your judgment. This is where the real value lies. It means understanding how to break down problems for AI consumption and knowing how to iterate when AI doesn't give you the results that you want. It's about becoming fluent in that back and forth conversation with these tools. But the critical skill, and this is where the senior and experienced engineers really distinguish themselves, is the judgment. Knowing when to accept AI suggestions and when to override them, when to delegate and when to take control. The engineers who excel aren't the ones that are using it for everything. They're the ones who are using it very thoughtfully. They let AI handle the boilerplate, and they focus their expertise where it matters the most. Unpacking requirements, designing the architecture, the parts that require the really deep understanding. Master this balance and you'll become invaluable in any engineering organization. And remember, you're still accountable for every line of code. This is crucial to understand. AI doesn't change your responsibility as an engineer. I've seen engineers fall into the trap of thinking that just because they're using AI-generated code, somehow the quality bar doesn't apply to them. This is a really dangerous mindset. Whether you wrote it by hand or you prompted an AI to generate it, it's still your code. The best engineers we've interviewed understand this completely. They review AI-generated code just as critically as they review any other code from colleagues. They test it thoroughly, they understand what it does and why it works, and they can justify the design decisions. Remember what I said earlier. AI saves the typing, but it will not eliminate the thinking. Your job is to do the thinking, make the decisions, and ensure a high-quality result. AI is a very sophisticated productivity tool, but don't let it become a crutch that weakens your engineering discipline. Use it to amplify your expertise and not to replace your judgment. And the final point is that I believe AI-assisted interviews are the future, and you should start getting familiar with this format now as an interviewer, rather than later on when you're a candidate. Many of you will be conducting technical interviews over the next weeks and months. Instead of waiting for your company to change the process, start advocating for this in your current role. There's huge advantages to getting this experience early. You'll understand how AI tools actually perform in interview situations. You'll see firsthand what separates candidates who truly understand AI collaboration from those who are just accepting the suggestions. Plus, when you're eventually interviewing elsewhere, this experience will set you apart as someone who is not just a user of AI tools, but is someone who is actively shaping how the industry adopts them. And if you're not getting the support that you need and the type of growth and innovation that you're looking for in your current workplace, maybe it's time to find somewhere that does. And now for the managers who identified themselves at the beginning of the talk, so we all know who you are. If you haven't pushed or put AI coding tools in the hands of your engineers, you're behind and you need to address this ASAP. I would bet that your top engineers are already using these tools. You'll have engineers paying for Cursor, Copilot, Claude code out their own pocket because they don't feel productive without these tools. They're copying and pasting code through ChatGPT because maybe that's their only option. Because besides the immediate obvious security and compliance risk, you're about to start losing your best people. They're going to be frustrated that they can move faster on personal projects than they can in their work environment. And we know that the best engineers gravitate towards environments where they can be the most productive. Because the cost of these tools to the company is negligible to an engineer's salary, or the cost of replacing them. So stop treating AI tools as nice to have. Make them standard issue just like you would with laptops or IDE licenses. And your engineers will thank you, and more importantly, they'll stick around. Uplift your teams. Start by talking to your heaviest AI users. Find the engineers who are already getting great results with these tools and understand what they're doing differently. They're your AI power users, and they've already figured out what works in your specific domain and code base. Hold these folks up as examples. Get them to share their techniques in team meetings, document their workflows, maybe do internal lunch and learns. You want to systematically capture and spread their knowledge through the teams. But don't expect everyone to figure this out overnight. Give your engineers dedicated time to experiment with these tools. Maybe it's 20% time, maybe it's a dedicated learning sprint like what we did, but make it clear that AI fluency is part of the job, not something that should be worked in after hours. Because the engineers who are slow to adopt these tools aren't necessarily resistant to change. They might just not know where to start or feel overwhelmed by the options. And remember the diagram from earlier. Interview questions and job requirements need to be aligned. If the interview doesn't match the role, you're going to end up hiring the wrong people. So when did you last update your interview questions? If it was before ChatGPT was released, then you have a problem. And like I said, your best engineering tools, or your best engineers will be using these tools daily. But if you're still testing on whether they can implement a binary search from memory, you're focusing on the wrong thing. So take a hard look at your current interview process. Are you evaluating the skills that engineers actually need in 2025, or just skills that were important 5 years ago? And as you're doing that evaluation, seriously consider allowing AI into your interviews. Because if you're not, you're missing critical signals about how candidates will actually perform. These are the skills that will require or distinguish great engineers in 2025 and beyond. And if you're not getting support for this kind of innovation in your current workplace, come and find us, because we're always looking for great engineering leaders who want to shape the future of engineering. And with that, I've shown you our journey, the challenges, the learnings, and the results. And it certainly wasn't easy, but the outcome is that we now have an interview process that is more closely aligned with how Canva's engineering work is done day to day. And I'll leave you with a quote from Brendan, our CTO, that we believe that the future belongs to engineers who can seamlessly blend human creativity and judgment with AI capabilities. And this is true more so now than ever. We've shown that it's possible, and so the question is, are you willing to take the leap? Thanks a lot.